Welcome to Dear Fans. Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the black SUV, her heels clicking against the courthouse steps. The morning air was crisp, the sky a dull gray stretching endlessly above the city. She adjusted the cuffs of her navy blue blazer, the fabric smooth beneath her fingertips. The press swarmed nearby, cameras, flashing voices merging into a distant hum. She didn't turn her head. She didn't acknowledge them. This was not the time for statements. Inside the courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper. A heavy silence settled over the rows of spectators, journalists with pens poised, local officials with unreadable expressions, civilians who had come out of curiosity or quiet rage. The weight of history pressed against the walls, thick as dust, as if the room itself held memories of every injustice, every battle fought within it. Karoline sat at the defendant's table, spin straight, hands folded neatly. Her posture betrayed no tension, no hesitation. Across from her, Officer Bradley Simmons lounged in his chair, a smirk playing at the edge of his mouth. His uniform was immaculate, his badge gleaming under the artificial light. He tapped his fingers against the table in slow, deliberate rhythm, his confidence absolute. Judge Howard Grayson entered his presence, commanding, his silver hair thinning but his gaze sharp. He had presided over countless cases, had seen lies and truths twist together until they were nearly indistinguishable. This one, however, held a different weight. He could feel it in the air. The BFF called the court to order. The murmur of the crowd hushed. Karoline inhaled. Slow and steady, she had spent years standing behind podiums, fielding questions designed to shake her, navigating the minefield of Washington politics. But this was different. She glanced at Simmons, meeting his gaze for the briefest moment. He was certain of his victory, certain that his word, his uniform, his authority would be enough. Karoline knew better. The prosecutor stood, adjusting his tie with the precision of a man who believed in the strength of appearances. He cleared his throat, then turned to the jury, his voice steady, measured. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a simple truth. Law and order must be upheld. When an officer of the law gives an instruction, it is not a suggestion. Karoline barely listened. She knew his type, the kind that spoke in absolutes, that reduced nuance to rhetoric. Her gaze drifted to the jury, studying their faces. Some were already skeptical, their expressions tight with doubt. Others leaned forward, waiting to be convinced. They had not yet decided who they believed. Simmons sat with an air of controlled ease, shoulders back, hands clasped. He had done this before. He had won before. To him this was routine. The prosecutor continued, weaving a narrative of resistance, escalation, necessary force. She refused to comply. She raised her voice. She became aggressive. The officer had no choice but to act. Karoline's fingers brushed the edge of the table, smooth, would cool beneath her touch. She had stood at the White House podium and unraveled questions designed to break her. She had debated men twice her age who had underestimated her. This was no different. The prosecutor gestured toward Simmons. Officer Bradley Simmons is a decorated officer with an impeccable record. He has served this community for over a decade. A flicker of movement, a shift in posture. Karoline caught it. Simmons' jaw tightened, the smallest crack in his performance. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, the state calls Officer Simmons to the stand. Simmons rose, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the witness stand. His steps were deliberate, his expression carefully neutral. He took the oath, sat, adjusted the microphone. When he spoke, his voice was steady. The defendant was loitering near a closed business. I approached her, asked for identification. She refused. She became uncooperative. A pause, a glance toward the jury, a calculated breath. She attempted to strike me. She reached for my weapon. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The jury shifted. Karoline remained still. She had heard this lie before, in different forms, in different places. It had always worked until now. Benjamin Carter stood slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his sleeves. He moved without urgency, his presence steady, deliberate. He let the silence stretch just long enough to settle into the room. Then, with a measured step, he approached the witness stand. Officer Simmons, he began, his voice calm. Even you've testified that my client was aggressive, that she resisted your instructions, that she, in your words, reached for your weapon. Simmons nodded. That's correct. Benjamin folded his hands behind his back, tilting his head slightly. Ly, tell me, officer, in your 10 years on the force, how many times has your body camera malfunctioned? A flicker of hesitation, small but they're not often. Benjamin nodded slowly. And yet it happened that night. Simmons' fingers curled slightly against the armrest. It happens. Technology isn't perfect. Benjamin let the answer hang in the air, then turned, pacing slowly in front of the jury. Of course, but let's talk about what we do have. He stopped, his gaze leveling on Simmons. Would you say your report of that night is accurate? Yes. Benjamin reached into his briefcase, pulled out a folder, and set It on the table beside him. And if we had evidence that contradicted your report, what would you say then? Simmons' expression hardened, his smirk faltering just slightly. I'd say, I stand by my account. Benjamin exhaled, slow, controlled. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small USB drive, and held it up between his fingers. Fingers, Your Honor, he said, turning toward the judge. The defense submits video evidence recorded by a bystander during the incident. The room shifted, the energy changed, a murmur moved through the gallery. Like a wave, Simmons' grip tightened against the chair. His smirk was gone now. Karoline didn't look at him. She kept her gaze forward, steady, unreadable. She already knew what the video would show. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the bailiff took the USB drive from Benjamin and inserted it into the media system. The screen flickered to life, and the grainy footage began to play. The camera's angle was imperfect, filmed from a parked car across the street, but the audio was unmistakable. Simmons's voice rang out first. Sharp, commanding, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Then Karoline's voice, calm but firm, I'm not resisting, let go of my arm. The footage showed Simmons's gripping her wrist, shoving her against the patrol car with force. Her body tensed, but she didn't fight back. Then came the words that changed everything. Women like you don't get to question me. The reaction was immediate, a ripple of gasps, murmurs rising like a tide. The judge banged his gavel twice, calling for order, but the weight of what had just been heard was already sinking in. Simmons shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his hands, so steady before, clenched into fists. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at Karoline. Benjamin let the silence stretch. He wanted the moment to settle, for every juror to absorb what they had just witnessed. Then he turned, his voice quiet but cutting. Officer Simmons, would you care to explain that? Simmons opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Karoline sat motionless, her posture unchanged, her hands rested lightly on the table, her face unreadable. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was already speaking for itself. The tension in the courtroom felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone. The jury shifted in their seat, their faces a mixture of shock and calculation. The prosecutor, who had been so confident at the start of the trial, now sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, fingers drumming against the table. Simmons swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His hands, which had been so sure, so steady, now gripped the arms of his chair like a man clinging to the last bit of solid ground beneath him. Benjamin let the silence stretch for another beat, then took a step forward. Officer Simmons, he said, his voice, even his words, deliberate. The jury just heard you say, and I quote, women like you don't get to question me. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in again. Tell us, officer, what exactly did you mean by that? Simmons sat rigid, his gaze flickering toward the judge, then to the jury. He cleared his throat. That's not what it sounds like. Benjamin raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. Really? Because to me it sounds an awful lot like you weren't acting in the interest of public safety. It sounds like you were asserting dominance, control. He took another step forward. It sounds like you were using your badge to put a woman in her place. A low murmur ran through the gallery. Again, the judge lifted his gavel, but he didn't strike it this time. He simply watched. Simmons's lips pressed into a thin line. His once cocky demeanor was crumbling, the foundation beneath him cracking. Benjamin turned to the jury. Leaden, go over the facts one more time. My client, who has no criminal record, no history of violence, was standing on a public sidewalk checking her phone. Officer Simmons approached her, demanded identification without cause, and when she asked why he escalated the situation, he turned back to Simmons, and when she refused to be intimidated, you grab her. Simmons shook his head, his voice strained. That's not what happened. Benjamin smiled faintly, turning back toward the screen where the video had frozen on the image of Simmons pinning Karoline against his patrol car. Then explain this. Simmons didn't answer. Benjamin let out a slow breath and walked back to the defense table, resting his hands lightly on the surface. Let's move on, he said. Officer Simmons, you claimed that my client reached for your weapon, but in this video her hands are nowhere near your holster. Would you like to amend your statement? Simmons' face darkened. I know what I saw. Benjamin nodded. Right, just like you knew your body camera malfunctioned at the exact moment this altercation took place. Simmons remained silent. Benjamin turned to the jury. Again, ladies and gentlemen, the defense has presented evidence that contradicts Officer Simmons' claims. The video does not show a violent suspect resisting arrest. It does not show a woman reaching for a weapon. What it does show is a man in power who became angry when his authority was questioned, a man who used force when none was needed, a man who lied. He turned back to Simmons, his voice dropping into something sharper. Officer, do you still stand by your statement? Simmons shifted, his shoulders stiff. He exhaled sharply. I did what I had to do. Benjamin let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. No, officer, you did what you thought you could get away with. The jury was watching Simmons now, their expressions unreadable, but weighted with judgment. The cracks in his story had become fractures, widening with every moment that passed. Benjamin took a step back, glancing at Karoline. She had not moved, had not spoken. She didn't need to. She simply held herself with a kind of quiet power that needed no defense. He turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I have no further questions. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. Officer Simmons, you may step down. Simmons rose from the stand stiffly, his face pale, his once confident stride replaced with something slower, heavier. He returned to his seat, but he no longer sat with his shoulders squared. He no longer smarted, murked. Benjamin turned to Karoline. Are you ready? He murmured. She stood without answering, smoothing the front of her blazer before walking toward the witness stand. The room seemed to hold its breath as she took her seat. The prosecutor hesitated before approaching, adjusting his tie as if it had suddenly become too tight. He cleared his throat. Miss Leavitt, you have served as the White House press secretary, yes, and in that role you've handled countless situations under pressure. Correct. A pause, then a slight no. Correct. The prosecutor clasped his hands in front of him. Is it possible that in this situation you reacted out of instinct, that you perhaps unintentionally became confrontational with the officer? Karoline met his gaze, her expression steady as a spokesperson. My job is to answer questions. That night, I asked one, and for that I was thrown against a car. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Again, the prosecutor hesitated. Miss Leavitt, would you say you trust law enforcement? She tilted her head slightly, considering the question. I trust those who uphold the law, not those who hide behind it. The prosecutor's lips pressed together. He glanced at his notes, flipping a page, as if searching for something stronger, something more substantial, but there was nothing left. He exhaled through his nose. No further questions. Karoline turned toward Benjamin. As he rose, he approached the stand with the same quiet confidence he had carried all trial. Miss Leavitt, do you believe you did anything wrong that night? No. Benjamin nodded. Would you like to tell the jury in your own words what happened? Karoline exhaled softly and folded her hands on the stand. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear, measured. I was standing outside checking my phone. Officer Simmons approached me, asked for my ID. I asked why. He didn't answer. Instead, he demanded I comply. When I asked again, he grabbed my arm. When I pulled back, he forced me against the car. I never raised my voice. I never resisted. I only asked a question. She turned slightly, looking toward the jury, her gaze unwavering, and for some people, that is enough to be seen as a threat. The room was silent. The weight of her words settled over the jury, the gallery, even the judge. Benjamin let the moment stretch before speaking. Miss Leavitt, you have stood in front of some of the most powerful people in the world. You have been challenged by reporters, by politicians, by entire administrations. Have you ever been treated the way Officer Simmons treated you that night? A pause, then no. Benjamin let out a quiet breath and turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense rests. The judge gave a slow nod. We will move to closing arguments. As Karoline stepped down, she did not look at Simmons. She did not look at the prosecutor. She simply returned to her seat, her back straight, her presence unshaken. She had already won. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that stretched thick and unyielding, pressing against every breath. The gallery sat still, absorbing what they had just heard. The jury, their faces tight with concentration, avoided looking at Simmons. His presence, once exuding confidence, now felt small. Judge Grayson shifted slightly in his chair, then leaned forward, his voice low but firm. We will now move to closing arguments. Mr. Avery, you may proceed. The prosecutor stood slowly, adjusting his tie, though it no longer had the air of practiced control. He turned toward the jury, hands clasped in front of him. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice steady but lacking its earlier conviction. Law enforcement officers make decisions in difficult, sometimes dangerous situations. Officer Simmons responded to what he believed was a potential threat. In the moment, he acted in the interest of public safety. A pause, a breath. Now I understand that the defense has painted a compelling picture, a picture of an offer overstepping of an individual mistreated, but we must remember that the law is not about emotions, it is about facts, and the fact remains that Officer Simmons was performing his duty. Another pause, longer. This time Avery's gaze flickered toward Simmons for only a fraction of a second, but the damage was already done. The jury saw it, the uncertainty, the distance, the crack in his own argument. He exhaled softly. I trust you will see the facts for what they are. Thank you. He returned to his seat without another word. The judge gave a small nod. Mr. Carter. Benjamin Carter rose, buttoning his jacket. As he moved toward the jury, he did not speak. Immediately, he let the silence work for him, let the weight of what had already been said linger in the Ere then his voice came smooth, quiet, but unmistakably sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, you just heard the prosecution ask you to focus on the facts. He spread his hand slightly. So let's do exactly that. He turned toward Karoline, who sat with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the trial. My client, he continued, is not a criminal. She is not a threat. She is not violent. She is a public servant, a woman who has spent her career speaking truth to power, and for that she was thrown against a car and arrested. He let the words settle, then turned toward Simmons, who sat motionless, his jaw locked tight. The prosecution wants you to believe that Officer Simmons was simply doing his job, that he made AIT's second decision to ensure public safety. He shook his head slightly. But tell me, what threat was she? He let the question hang before answering it himself. The only thing my client did that night was ask why, and for some people, that is enough to be dangerous. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Benjamin turned back to the jury. You've seen the video, you've heard the testimony, you watched Officer Simmons sit on that stand and tell you a story that unraveled the moment the truth came to light. He took a step closer. So I ask you, if he lied about what happened to my client, what else has he lied about? The prosecutor stiffened. The jury took that in, some exchanging glances, others keeping their gazes fixed forward, their thoughts turning behind their eyes. Benjamin's voice dropped slightly. This case is not just about Karoline Leavitt, it is about the responsibility that comes with power, because power without accountability is not protection, it is oppression. He turned slightly, gesturing towards Simmons. Officer Simmons assumed he would not be questioned. He assumed that his word, his authority, his uniform would be enough. And for years he was right. His eyes swept the jury again. But today you get to prove him wrong. A beat of silence. Then I trust you to do what is right. Benjamin turned and walked back to his seat. Judge Grayson exhaled softly, then straightened in his chair. The jury will now deliberate the Bath led them from the room, and for the first time in hours the courtroom erupted into quiet conversation, hushed whispers threading through the crowd like electricity. Karoline remained still. She had done her part. Now all she had to do was wait. The courthouse hallway was colder than the courtroom itself. The walls, the marble floors, even the air, all of it seemed detached from the weight of what was happening behind closed doors. Benjamin paced in slow, deliberate strides, his hands in his pockets, his jaw set in deep thought. Karoline sat on the bench against the wall, her posture still perfect, but her fingers traced the edge of her sleeve in slow, rhythmic motions. The minutes stretched, then the bailiff stepped into the hall. The jury has reached a verdict. Benjamin stilled. Karoline stood. Together they walked back into the courtroom. Inside, the air had changed. The gallery had filled again, eyes flickering toward the jewelry box with anticipation. The judge sat with the same stoic expression, though there was a weight to the way he folded his hands in front of him. Karoline took her seat. Simmons sat stiffly, his knuckles white against the table. The foras of the jury, a middle-aged woman with serious eyes, rose as the judge addressed her. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor. She unfolded the piece of paper in her hands, cleared her throat, and read, in the case of the state versus Karoline Leavitt, we find the defendant not guilty on all charges. A breath, a silence, then a ripple of sound, gasps, murmurs, someone exhaling audibly. Karoline felt Benjamin's hand on her shoulder, a firm and steady presence. She exhaled slowly, allowing herself to take in the moment. The forers continued. Furthermore, we, the jury, strongly recommend an internal investigation into Officer Simmons' conduct. Simmons tense. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Grayson nodded. Once the court acknowledges this recommendation, he turned towards Simmons, his voice carrying a note of finality. Officer Simmons, the first suggest you retain counsel. This matter is far from over. Simmons said nothing. He simply sat there, his face blank, his hands still clenched. The judge struck his gavel. Court is adjourned. The room erupted. Karoline stood, the press already turning toward her, cameras clicking, voices rising in a chaotic swirl of questions. She turned to Benjamin. You did good, he murmured. She gave him a small, knowing smile. So, did you then? She turned toward the crowd, toward the world that had been watching, waiting, and for the first time since this battle began, she spoke. This isn't just my victory, she said, her voice even steady. It's a victory for accountability, for justice, and for everyone who has ever been silenced by those in power. The cameras flashed. The crowd listened. She had won, but the fight was far from over. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.